Now, I've been looking forward to telling this particular story, and let's actually get it cracking straight away with really what is quite a comprehensive image of what we're going to cover in this particular session. I want you to be aware of what the broad background of the modern Olympics is. So first things first, the Olympic Games, there's not meant to be a question mark there, it should be end of the ancient games. This initial ancient games endured nearly 1,000 years. Between 776 BC and 394 AD. And interestingly, obviously we're going to look at the modern Olympics primarily in this tutorial, but interestingly, the main fact that led to the end of the Olympic Games was Christianity, which is in itself a bit of an interesting concept, right? We sort of tend to link sort of good sporting Olympic type ideals to sort of Christian ethos, right? So it's kind of interesting that was the factor that led to it being removed. But we're going to kind of, from there, we're going to jump forward well over 1,000 years, and we're going to talk about this Cotswold Dover Games. Now, in order to kind of reflect this, I've got this image here, which is an image which is a drawing of what happens in the games, and obviously the Cotswolds being in sort of central south of England. But you notice here that it's a multi-event sporting event. It's got stick fighting, it seems to have gymnastics, it seems to have this thing here which is called Shin Kicking. Amazing sport if you at some point want to get that onto YouTube for you. Bear with me a second. Shin Kicking. If you want to be having a look at that, you might find some interesting stuff. You can see here that we've got some kind of racing, what appeared to be some kind of athletics pursuit. This was a multi-event sporting activity that took place from 1612 onwards, and was established by an individual called Robert Dover. Okay, Robert Dover, hence the Dover Games. And this becomes like almost a forerunner to the modern Olympic Games, this multi-activity type event. Now again, we're going to zoom forward a little bit further, and we're going to get all the way to 1850. And in 1850, I want to introduce you to this character here. His name is Dr. Penny Brookes, okay, Dr. William Penny Brookes, in fact. And this individual, Dr. Brookes, a really inspirational character in this particular story. He's based in Shropshire, and in 1850, he develops what are known as the Much Wenlock Olympian Games. The Much Wenlock Olympian Games. Now, this again is another example of a multi-event sporting occasion. In this case, he was a social reformer, and he wanted to use sort of the educational aspects of sport to educate people. Now, that's not dissimilar to what was happening in the public schools at this kind of time. And it involved things like athletics, running and throwing. Now, what's particularly interesting about Brookes is he was a reformer. And you'll see here that in 1890, he received a visit from this person here. Great moustache, I think we can all agree. This individual here is Baron Pierre de Coubertin. Now, this is a French land-owning gentry fellow who's particularly interested in sporting athleticism. And he's particularly interested in kind of the legacy of the ancient Olympic Games, but he's also studying the practices, amongst other things, going on in British public schools in the 19th century. He comes to England, he visits public schools like Rugby, for example. He meets up with Penny Brookes and talks about this Olympic ideal, more of which we're going to get in a second. And he starts working towards the modern Olympics, or what we know now as the modern Olympics. And I'll come back to that word modern and we'll reflect on that in a second. But a couple of things that are interesting to note here is that by 1896, 6 years later, de Coubertin has established the first of the first Olympic Games, based in the Panathinaikos Stadium in Athens, for over 1,500, specifically 1,502 years. So 1,502 years later, the Games return to Greece, and it is the work of, amongst others, this French Baron de Coubertin. Now, this Panathinaikos Stadium hosted a whole bunch of countries competing. There were countries from Western Europe. There was indeed the US. There was Canada. There was Chile. Notice some of the countries that weren't taking part. There was Australia. I'll just put Oz like that. Australia taking part in this Athens 896. So this kind of modern Olympics was really at that point more of a narrow concept. It's also worth bearing in mind that in terms of modernity, in this Olympic Games here, women were not only allowed to compete, but they weren't allowed in the stadium. So you've got to consider what modern really, really means. Now, of course, what we're then going to sort of start to think about is how that develops into the Games, let's say London Games in 2012. And of course, I happen to be recording this 10 years after the 2012 games, and you might think that's ages and ages ago, your age, but these games are relatively recent, of course. Now, a couple of things I want you to be aware of with regard to the Athens Games that was re-established. They did a couple of interesting things. Like I said, they invited these countries. They did all kinds of odd sports. One-arm weightlifting. Have a think about that one. Was a sport in this modern Olympic Games. They also took part in things like mixed tennis. Now, you might understand mixed tennis to be one male, one female performer. No. This was, for example, Great Britain and the US sharing a team, for example. And it was really important to stress that this was amateur only, so no professionals were allowed. And we also know it was men only. Okay, so these are some of the players in the reinvention of the Olympic movement, the Olympic Games. Now, can I stress to you a couple of summary points that I think are really important to drive home? Realise the importance of British public schools. Now, you will be studying these in separate tutorials, presumably, possibly with me and my videos, etc. But British public schools were developing their nature of athleticism at this exact time. It was those schools that Coubertin, amongst other places, visited. So we've got this real notion of the values of athleticism. We've got moral integrity combined with physical endeavour. And that was really central to this development. But also, we also need to identify, and we see this to an extent these days as well, of course, with the Olympic movement. It was a real desire to bring peace and unity to what was a very conflict-based world, but to bring peace and unity. Now, obviously, if you know anything about the first half of the 20th century, the 50 years that followed this, you know that peace and unity didn't go that well. We could think of First World War, Second World War, but that was the intent of these Olympic Games. And I really want you to refer back to those characters, Robert Dover, William Penny Brookes, de Coubertin, the Cotswold Games, the much Wenlock Games, and ultimately the Panathinaikos Stadium in Athens in 1896, leading to what we all know and love today, which is the Olympic, and also don't forget the Winter Olympic Games. Hope that's useful. Thanks.